On takeoff from Melbourne, Australia, a fully laden Airbus A340 carrying close to 300 passengers and crew members accelerates down the runway. The first officer's jet refuses to take off, no matter how hard he tugs on the controls, even when the end of the runway is drawing near. Sparks fly as its tail scuffs violently on the ground. An eerie crimson glow enters the cabin, frightening the passengers. Before it's too late, will they manage to get into the air? Or will they crash into each other at the end of the runway, becoming Australia's worst ever aviation accident? This is the horrific tale of Emirates Flight 407, a tale mostly unrelated to runways and engines and entirely focused on do with human psychology. On the night of Friday, March 20th, 2009, 257 passengers and 18 crew boarded Emirates Flight 407 at Melbourne in Australia. They were bound for Dubai, a 14-hour journey. It was a perfect night for flying. Light winds and no clouds to speak of. The plane being used for the flight was a 5-year-old Airbus A340-500, a modern 4-engined aircraft with an excellent safety record, and one of the few which could carry out this ultra-long journey without stopping to refuel. Owing to the long duration of the flight, there were not 2 but 4 pilots on board. 2 of them would carry out the takeoff and landing, while the other 2, the so-called augmenting crew, would take over during the cruise portion of the flight to allow the main crew to rest. As per Emirates Airlines procedures, the augmenting crew were required to be in the cockpit not just for the cruise, but also for the pre-flight preparations and during takeoff and landing. Like many other airlines, Emirates believed that having an extra set of eyes and ears on these lengthy flights would give an extra layer of security. This adds to the confusion surrounding what is likely to occur on the ground here. The pilots were busy completing the crucial pre-departure procedures while the passengers checked in and the last of the luggage was loaded. This group had a lot of experience. Between them, the first officer and the captain had flown more than 8,000 hours. In the A340, they logged thousands of hours, and in its smaller 2-engined cousin, even more. Day 330. But this evening, their familiarity with a marginally different aircraft would make them a liability rather than a strength, a crucial difference. During these preparations, the aircraft was buzzing with activity. There were 5 people in the cockpit, the 2 pilots, 2 ground engineers, and the augmenting captain. So crowded was the cockpit, in fact, that the augmenting first officer had to stand outside in the forward galley and wait for the ground engineers to leave. First officer and captain go over paperwork while pilots and ground engineers gab. Here's where the first officer committed a straightforward yet grave error. Everything began when he entered the gross weight, the overall weight of the aircraft, into the electronic flight bag, or FB. Essentially, this is an iPad that has been carefully engineered to determine the configuration that the aircraft must be in before taking off. The EFB determined the speed at which the plane could lift off, the thrust setting required for the engines, and the flap setting that would be required for takeoff using the numbers that the first officer had provided. When he entered the aircraft's weight, he let his finger go. Rather than entering 362.9 tons, the actual weight of the aircraft, he typed in 262.9 tons. In other words, he told the computer, which calculates the aircraft's performance on takeoff, that the plane was a full 100 tons lighter than it actually was. What this meant was that the computer completely underestimated the amount of power the engines would need to get the plane into the air. It also underestimated the flap setting needed to produce the lift required for takeoff, and it underestimated the speed required to get off the ground. However, as consequential as this mistake was, there was a high level of redundancy built into not just aircraft systems, but procedures as well. Before they lined up on the runway, the pilots would have had multiple opportunities to catch this error. Speaking of redundancy, if you're anything like me, you probably think that by now, the majority of web browsers are a little out of date. Even if it seems like the internet has become more vibrant and dynamic in recent years, web browsers like Chrome and Safari are still somewhat difficult to use. Hence, I utilize the upper one. It's the Airbus A350 of online browsers, essentially. I adore the slick, contemporary UI which makes all of the apps I use easily accessible on the sidebar, regardless of the number of tabs I'm open. For example, let's pretend I'm researching one of these videos and I want to post something interesting I find on Instagram or Twitter. Sorry, I can just click those icons on the sidebar and post it in the same way. I can just pop open WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger to reply to a message instantly. It's all really fast and seamless. It's also great having a built-in VPN and ad blocker, which I can turn on with a single click. I'm one of those people who has way too many tabs open at any given moment. So for me, the Tab Islands feature is especially useful. I can just group similar tabs together and expand and shrink them as needed. This really helps with organizing my work, and it saves a lot of space. I also like that Opera's own AI area is embedded into the browser itself. So whenever you have a question which would take too long to Google, you could just pop open Area and ask it. Try it up Upper One using my link in the video description so you can see what I'm talking about for yourself. Well, back to the video for now. After obtaining the EFB, the captain started examining the data that the first officer had input. The first officer started entering these numbers into his copy of the flight plan in the meanwhile. However, the captain was sidetracked from his task by a remark made by someone else on the flight deck while the pilots were working. Even after answering it, he never finished checking everything. Had he done so, he would have learned that the initial officer had entered an incorrect weight value for the aircraft, leading to the incorrect statistics being produced by the EFB for the aircraft's performance during takeoff. These fictitious numbers were now input by the captain into the flight management system, the aircraft's brain. Importantly, at this point, both pilots were supposed to check verbally between each other that the takeoff weight entered into the EFB and the figure written into the flight plan by the first officer matched. This crucial check would clearly reveal that the first officer had entered the wrong figure into the EFB one, which was 100 tons lighter than the figure in the flight management computer. But this verbal confirmation never took place. There was now one last check standing between the pilots, and disaster, as the 257 passengers settled in. They had no idea that up front in the cockpit, a small error was slipping through the cracks with alarming ease. As they neared the end of their checks, the pilots had a final chance to detect their mistake. The first officer read out the figures from his copy of the flight plan, and the captain checked that these figures match those in the flight management computer. This is a photocopy of the first officer's flight plan. When he read out the figure for the takeoff weight here, he started by saying 326.9 tons, and then noticing that the figure he had written was 100 tons off. He changed the 2 to a 3, and then read out the correct figure of 362.9 tons on this copy of the flight plan. You can just about see the line he added to turn what was a 2 into a 3. The captain confirmed that this figure was the one in the flight management computer, so everything was fine as far as he knew. It's important to keep in mind that the flight management computer recorded this weight as accurate. However, this was irrelevant because the wrong weight of 262.9 tons was used in all of the takeoff performance calculations made with the iPad and EFB. The pilots have now infiltrated the aircraft's brain with these inaccurate computation results. Seeing as how there was a difference between what he had written, what was in the flight plan, and what was in the flight management computer, the first officer had the option to decide at this point to double-check the data just to be sure. However, the captain had already verified his numbers as he knew. And besides, he figured that he must have simply made a mistake when writing the number into the flight plan rather than when entering it into the EFB. So with that, the cabin doors closed, along with the door of opportunity for the pilots to notice their error. At 10:18 that night, Flight 407 pushed back from the gate 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The final domino had fallen before the plane had even reached the runway. The pilot started the aircraft for Rolls-Royce engines and began taxiing out to runway 16 at Melbourne. Their route would take them south initially, and then out to the west towards Dubai. It was the first officer's leg, so he taxied the aircraft along the ground while the captain went through the before takeoff checklists as they taxied out. The pilot set the flaps to the first setting rather than to the second or third, where they would have been if the correct aircraft weight had been entered into the EFB. As a result, when the aircraft began taking off, the wings would generate less lift, making it harder for the plane to get airborne at 10:30 that night. Flight 407 lined up on the runway. Now, nothing stood between the pilots and the mistakes they had made back at the gate. The first officer pushed the thrust levers to the flex thrust setting, and the 4 engines roared to life. So everything was fine as far as he knew. It's important to keep in mind that the flight management computer recorded this weight as accurate. However, This was irrelevant because the wrong weight of 262.9 tons was used in all of the takeoff performance calculations made with the iPad and EFB. The pilots have now infiltrated the aircraft's brain with these inaccurate computation results. Seeing as how there was a difference between what he had written, what was in the flight plan, and what was in the flight management computer, the first officer had the option to decide at this point to double-check the data, just to be sure. However, the captain had already verified his numbers as our justification for an aborted takeoff. The pilots could feel the aircraft speeding up as the rhythmic bumping of the nose wheel on the runway centerline lights became faster. Then they reached the speed marked as V1, the point of no return. Now the pilots were committed to the takeoff. No matter what happened, the plane beat an engine fire, a burst tire, or anything else to abort the takeoff after this speed would be to risk going off the end of the runway. Seconds later, it reached VR rotation speed. The first officer pulled on his side stick to bring the nose of the plane into the air. The only problem was that these speeds were based on calculations for a much lighter aircraft. VR had been calculated as being 145 knots, almost 20 knots. Too slow for how heavy the plane was. In reality, the plane would not be able to make it into the air until it was traveling at least 163 knots, or 300 km/h. But these calculations already made. The pilots would have to find this out the hard way. The first officer pulled on his side stick. The nose didn't rise. He pulled back further. Still nothing happened. Terrifyingly, the plane continued, accelerating down the runway with no sign that it would lift off. The aircraft was now less than 1,000 meters from the end of the runway, and the strip of lights, marking the threshold, without coming into view. The pilots were running out of options. There was no way they could abort the takeoff at this point. The captain told the first officer to pull back on his side stick for a second time. The first officer pulled back more, and finally the nose of the plane rose. But to the pilot's horror, the rest of the plane didn't follow. The first officer continued pulling back and the nose rose higher and higher, but they could see from their instruments that the height above the ground remained 0. The first officer, now desperately trying to get the aircraft to climb, kept pulling back until the tail of the aircraft slammed into the runway. Sparks went flying as the aluminum fuselage ground against the runway at almost 300 km/h. The impact was so severe that the flight data recorder, one of the plane's black boxes, fell off its rack onto the fuselage skin itself. The skin of the aircraft was being shredded and passengers could smell smoke and burning metal and insulation. The cabin was lit with a terrifying red glow. In a matter of seconds, the plane would careen off the end of the runway. Seeing this, the captain shoved the engines to maximum thrust. It was a desperate attempt. In the darkness beyond the runway lights, he was certain now that it was over for him and his nearly 300 passengers and crew. A specific calamity moving at more than 300 km/h or over 160 knots. After the plane's tail scraped the mud as it proceeded off the end of the runway, its main wheels eventually lifted off the ground. The tail came along a moment later, but the plane was only just getting airborne. Its tail pierced the aircraft's skin when it collided with the localizer antenna. After then, it struck one of the runway lights. This crisis was far from being resolved. Leading officer hobbled the damaged plane into the air, desperate enough to sink back down into the ground as they climbed timidly out. A warning appeared on their central display. Tail strike. The tower controller too had seen the sparks generated by the tail as it scraped against the runway, and they alerted the pilots as if it wasn't already clear. The crew knew that they wouldn't be continuing to Dubai. They needed to get back to Melbourne. But now their heavyweights came to haunt them again. Except this time it had to do with their fuel. With over 130 tons of it on board, the plane was well above its maximum landing weight. The pilots would need to dump a lot of fuel before they could return to the airport. Air traffic control cleared the flight to climb to 7,000 feet and directed them out over the water to dump fuel. The crew's adrenaline was surging at this point. If the captain hadn't pushed the engines to maximum power at the last moment, they could very well have crashed through the trees at the end of the runway, igniting a fireball. But they couldn't let this adrenaline get to them. They would need every ounce of concentration to assess the damage and formulate a plan to get back to Melbourne. A key part of that plan was finding out how much fuel they'd have to jettison in order to land safely. And this is where, once again, the first officer would need the EFB. As the plane headed south towards the ocean, The first officer pulled the EFB out of its stowage compartment, but when he retrieved it and checked the screen, he was stunned. Staring him in the face was the takeoff page he had used earlier, and the figure in the box for takeoff weight was a full 100 tons less than the aircraft's actual weight. At this moment, he realized his mistake. His lapse in attention had nearly caused the deaths of almost 300 people, but the first officer barely had time to process this. When behind him, the augmenting first officer pointed out something concerning the aircraft was not pressurizing. The pilots exchanged glances as the terrible truth sunk in. When the tail had scraped against the runway, it had done so with such force that the skin of the aircraft itself had been worn away, creating multiple holes. The plane was no longer a sealed vessel, but there was no more time to think about what went wrong on takeoff. The pilots had to get on with the task at hand. The captain declared upon PANT air traffic control. PAN. PAN is the international urgency signal over the radio. It's one step below declaring a mayday. Flight 407 would now be given priority over other aircraft. Meanwhile, air traffic control dispatched vehicles to the runway to inspect the damage. In a few moments, they would be shocked by what they discovered. As this happened before, pilots began discussing how much fuel they should dump before landing. And here they had an important balance to strike. On one hand, they wanted to land under the maximum landing weight of 243 tons if it was heavier. They ran the risk of destroying the aircraft while landing. An even riskier proposition, given that they had no idea how severely injured the tail already was. But discharging nearly all of their gasoline would be necessary to get down to this weight. What would happen if, during their approach, they had to circle around and try landing a second or even a third time for whatever reason? They would require a lot of fuel in the event that this occurred, yet doing so would make them overweight on their first landing attempt. It was a tough choice to make, trying to strike a balance between not landing too heavy and yet still having enough fuel to make multiple attempts. In the end, the pilots decided that they would dump 80 tons of fuel. This would get their weight down to 280 tons, still above the maximum landing weight of 243 tons, but with enough to spare if they needed to make a few attempts at landing. This time, the pilots weren't going to take any chances when calculating their weight. Between them, they made 3 independent calculations for landing performance, 2 of them using the EFB and 1 of them using the aircraft's quick reference handbook. However, why weren't these crucial calculations receiving the same amount of attention on the ground? If only one small mistake had gotten past all of the safety measures while the aircraft was at the gate, the pilots would never even have found themselves in this situation. The fact that the sterile cockpit rule did not apply in a sterile cockpit while the vehicle was stopped at the gate contributed to the issue. Talking about anything but the current flight is not permitted. This rule is enforced during high workload stages of flight, like while maneuvering on the ground and any time below 10,000 ft. But because it doesn't apply when planes are parked at the gate, there was plenty of non-pertinent conversation in the cockpit during that point. This created an environment where distraction was inevitable. But what about the augmenting pilots? Weren't they supposed to be taking part in the pre-flight preparations too? How come they hadn't noticed that something was amiss? As it turned out, while the augmenting captain would typically check the takeoff performance calculations using a second FB in the cockpit, he had been unable to retrieve it from its compartment on this night due to the fact that there were 2 ground engineers in the cockpit as well. The augmenting first officer, for his part, wasn't even present for most of these preparations. He was in the forward galley waiting for the ground engineers to leave the cockpit. There was simply too much going on in the cockpit at this time for the pilots to follow the procedures to their full extent. Another problem for all of the pilots was that none of the figures generated by the IFB looked particularly off, and that's because all of these pilots also flew or had flown the Airbus A330, the smaller 2-engine version of the A340, where such weights and takeoff performance figures were quite typical. Therefore, the kind of errors in judgment that the pilots encountered were not the same as those that occur in domains like medicine, where dosage calculations might be inaccurate by a factor of 10 or even 100. Because there was a smaller range of possible values, the errors made by the pilot were more subtle and hence more difficult to identify. However, at 7,000 feet above the sea, with a broken tail and an aircraft that wouldn't put pressure on them, these reflections didn't really matter. There were 257 people on board the aircraft that the pilots had to safely return to the airport. The controller radio the flight, and told the crew that ground engineers had inspected the runway. They had found parts of the aircraft skin and broken pieces of equipment off the end of the runway, including a light and some antennae. Whatever damage the plane had, it must be serious. The captain made his first public address to the passengers, informing them that there had been a tail strike on takeoff and that they would be dumping fuel and returning to the airport. Many of the passengers were frightened. The grinding noise of the plane's skin against the runway, coupled with the red glow from all the sparks, had been terrifying. The flight attendants readied the cabin for landing, and the pilots started dumping fuel. As the fuel streamed out the nozzles on the trailing edges of the wings at a rate of 2.5 tons per minute. The captain kept the aircraft flying close to Melbourne in case he needed to return in a hurry to the pilots. The only indication of what had happened, the plane, was a message, which appeared on the central display to get a better understanding of the damage. They would need to ask the flight attendants sitting in the rear galley. The captain called the lead flight attendant into the cockpit, asking what observations they had from the takeoff, and trying to get an insight into the extent of the damage in the back of the aircraft. It seemed like the matter was under control at this time. Around 11:25 p.m. that evening, the pilots completed the fuel dump and started their descent in the direction of Melbourne. However, shortly after they started to descend, they noticed an odd rumbling sound. The crew then received the worst news yet before they could figure out what this might be. From the rear of the aircraft, one of the flight attendants called the cockpit to report that smoke was visible and odorous. The pilots had to return to the airfield right away. They had fewer than 20 minutes left before they crashed into the sea, knowing that there was fire on board. The first officer radar of the tower telling them of their intention to return immediately. They abandoned their plans to land on runway 16, which the winds favored, instead opting for a straight-in approach to the reciprocal runway, runway 34. Even notwithstanding the possible fire, this posed a challenge all of itself. Not only were the pilots landing overweight with possible damage due to a tail strike, but now they would be landing faster than usual because of the tailwind. The pilots quickly began setting the plane up for landing. The first officer told the lead flight attendant to prepare for a possible evacuation on landing in a fire. Every second counts. Meanwhile, the tower controller at Melbourne mobilized the airport's fire and rescue services to the runway. Here was a plane that had narrowly escaped disaster on takeoff, and now it appeared that it was about to face a second disaster on landing. The pilots lowered the gear and the flaps. It was a tense approach as the captain flew the plane down towards runway 34 when he touched down. He would need to brake heavily to bring the overhead plane to a stop on the runway. In a terribly ironic twist, he was now at risk of running the plane off the end of the runway for a second time in the same night. Roughly 1 hour ago at 11:36, Flight 407 broke through the lights on runways 3 and 4. After passing over the damaged runway, it touched down shortly after. The skipper engaged reverse thrust on the engines and floored it. As the airplane continued to decelerate, the first officer announced the speeds. At the end of the runway, the enormous aircraft finally came to a stop after a few heart-stopping moments. Amazingly, there were no fire indicators recorded by the emergency trucks. Of the 257 passengers, 18 crew members had made it out alive. Later that night, when the pilots and cabin crew had reached their hotel in Melbourne, Emirates contacted each of them by phone and forbade them from contacting their family or loved ones, saying that they were closely monitor their mobile phones and room phones. They then fired the pilots upon their return to Dubai. Public relations antics. In addition, pilots and airlines worldwide could benefit from the lessons learned in Flight 407. At Emirates and many other airlines, since this near miss in March 2009, new flight management computers have integrated software that notifies pilots if the takeoff performance statistics they enter are sufficient to lift the jet off the ground in the allotted runway length. To make sure that a single calculation cannot lead to a catastrophe, 2 pilots are now needed to independently calculate the takeoff performance data. These improvements, along with many others in the latest generation of aircraft from Boeing and Airbus, make events like Flight 407 far less likely. If you enjoyed this video, you can get early access to new videos and support the channel by joining these people here on Patreon. Or if you'd like to watch another video now, check this one up here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon in the next episode.